What happens when a country is built for war but forgets how to live? Can you build a just society by equalizing wealth, or will ambition always find a way to rebel? Why do the most admired cities in history fall apart, not from invasion, but from the inside out? Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth part of the series that I am doing on Aristotle's Politics. If you missed the previous parts, please check them out. Today we are going to continue book 2 and conclude it. We are continuing with Aristotle's criticism of Plato's Utopia and his other contemporaries, and also Aristotle's audit of real political communities that existed in his time: Sparta, Crete, and Carthage. If you enjoyed this series, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing, sharing with your friends. I'll keep posting more similar episodes in the future, at least once a week, before we finalize this book. And there will be future podcast episodes coming up, my conversations with other people, historians, philosophers, scientists, writers, and many more. We will take a look at Aristotle's take into why good ideas, good political ideas, break down in the real world and what goes wrong. As usually being the case with Aristotelian philosophy, we are mostly focusing on empirical evidence rather than pure theory building. So we are not at the part where we are building a separate political theories, but we are first looking at the past theories, past ideas that went wrong, that might go wrong if they are repeated, of course, from Aristotle's point of view. At this stage, his exploration is very similar to modern historians. Before you start building a new theory about politics, about society, about sociology, you take a look at what existed first before you. Theories proposed by other thinkers and real world examples. In this episode, Aristotle is focusing on three major political communities of his time. Sparta, this is a famous city-state that existed in modern-day Greece. Crete, that is a part of Greece today, this island. And Carthage, modern-day Tunisia, that was later absorbed into Roman Empire through Punic Wars. So this part continues the criticism that Aristotle raised in the previous episode that we explored about Plato's Utopia, that is explored in Plato's Republic through the words of Socrates. We're also focusing on the other work that Plato wrote, the Laws. Aristotle sees parallels between Plato's Republic and Laws. Both divide the population into farmers, soldiers, and deliberative ruling class. Criticism here is that Socrates doesn't address whether farmers and artisans should serve in the military, leaving a practical gap. And here we also have a word about brilliance and sophistication of theories built by Plato. But criticism is that theoretical elegance isn't enough. Aristotle insists we must ask, can this be implemented in a real city with real people and neighbors? This shows a great contrast between Plato and Aristotle. If you ever heard about this phrase, Platonic love, you may already know that Plato's philosophies are really about building grand theories from eternal point of view, from exploring the eternal truth, eternal love, eternal meaning of everything, and building grand theories, ideal cities, ideal understanding of love, ideal political community. But Aristotle is very, very different compared to his teacher Plato / Socrates. Why do I say / Socrates? Because if you read Plato, it is not always obvious whether it is Plato's own ideas or whether Plato speaking through whether it's exactly Socrates, because most of the works are in the form of dialogue between Socrates and other thinkers of his time. So it may be the case that Plato is just pointing out dialogues that Socrates have conducted and he's just taking notes, or Socrates maybe semi-fictional character here, where Plato is using Socrates to present his own ideas. It is widely accepted that the political philosophy that Plato presents in Republic and the Laws are mainly his own ideas. But Aristotle, in contrast to Plato, is very empirical. We explored this already in the previous episode, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing this in this part. He always starts by looking at the empirical evidence first, doing cost-benefit analysis, whether that works in practice or not, and then starting to build theories, grand theories. And so far, if you also looked at the previous episodes, you may already know that we are not trying to build a grand theory, grand, big, beautiful one theory about politics, political philosophy, but we are doing step-by-step analysis. So back to the criticism of Plato by Aristotle. Socrates says legislators should consider the land and the people, but Aristotle adds they must also consider neighboring states, because a real city must defend itself and participate in diplomacy, unless we consider our city in isolation. But that's rarely the case. So criticism here is that when Socrates / Plato talks about building the perfect city, they omit the neighbor. And Socrates says citizens should own just enough property to live moderately. But this is too vague. One can live moderately, but yet still live poorly, inefficiently. They can use their properties in an efficient way. And here's a criticism raised by Aristotle: clarity on what moderation means, what it entails in practical economic terms. Socrates also proposes equal property, equality of outcome among all the citizens, but does not define the number of citizens. If population size isn't coordinated with property distribution, the result can be conflict, crime, or instability. That's also common criticism raised in modern day. Yes, so if there is a pie, uh, that has to be distributed equally. If you add a lot of additional number of people that would benefit from this pie, the pie itself would diminish for each part. So every person would get smaller pie. So any consideration of economics, the redistribution should also take into account, okay, we have this big pie, we are talking about equality, but we also need to consider the number of people that is going to be benefited from this pie. That's the first point. But second point, okay, how do we also ensure that this pie gets bigger if we are not going to talk about the number of people? So that's a criticism essentially by Aristotle regarding the equality of outcome as proposed by Socrates. And the final criticism about the Plato's Republic regime that is proposed in Plato's Republic and Laws by Socrates. What kind of regime is this? There is a common property, communal raising of children, women serving in the army. It all sounds perfect in the theory, but the regime itself is not properly presented. It is not oligarchy because property is the same. The rulers / elite rule the state, not for the benefit of the few, but for the benefit of the state as overall. So this cannot be considered oligarchic state because the elite don't own property or rule in their own self-interest. But it's also not democratic because it lacks personal freedom and private life. There is a special time in calendar where sex is allowed. Children are taken from the families and raised in communal places for the benefit of the state, and property is equalized. And only the guardians are allowed to rule, and they are the ones getting the education. But this doesn't resemble any real political regime. It's not oligarchy, it's not democracy, it is not aristocracy. So the question here is that what kind of regime is this in practice? Has such regime ever been established in the past? That's the crucial question for Aristotle, because as we will see in the next part, he is really interested to look at the past, look at the present, examine the history, and see what kind of regimes are there and whether they work or not. Have they worked in the past or not? what kind of conditions are needed for a certain type of regime to emerge and prosper and exist. As we explored in the previous episode, the major concern that Aristotle has is that uh, risk of sacrificing the natural diversity of the city for the sake of unity. So unity is not the same as the happiness of the city, happiness of its citizens. Real city is diverse because it consists of several households, villages coming together, each having their own interests, each having their own skill set, people having different skill set, interests, and everything. So push for unity would destroy city at the end of the day. With that, we can conclude this part where Aristotle has been criticizing his teacher, Plato, and the ideal regime that he proposes. First, realism, whether it's possible in practice or not. Demographic planning is missing. If you're talking about equality, you should also consider the number of people that is going to benefit from this system. Missing link between property and population. How to manage this dynamic. There is one property. If everyone is going to benefit from this property, how do you make sure that property itself is being managed? And what kind of regime is this? That's about it for the criticism of Plato's Utopia and what are the possible disadvantages. Please also consider checking the previous episode because I covered this part more extensively in the previous episode regarding the criticism of Plato's Utopia by Aristotle. Next interesting question that Aristotle raises: why do conflicts and crimes arise in society? What could be the possible reason for that? This is the central question Aristotle poses. Understanding its cause, he argues, is essential for any legislator hoping to build a stable regime. At this point, we move into different philosopher that Aristotle is going to criticize extensively. Phaleas of Chalcedon, another utopian thinker. We actually don't know much about this philosopher, unlike Plato, but it's believed that he lived in the same time as Plato, and we know most about him through Aristotle's Politics, as we are exploring now. Phaleas claims that property inequality is the root of all civil strife. And what's the proposal? Make all property equal. We can also think of it in modern terms, equality of outcome. Make sure that everyone gets the same property, gets the same money, same amount of money, same amount of wealth, and this will resolve all the civil strife. This is what Phaleas argues. Phaleas says that in newly founded cities, this is very easy to achieve because when you're building a new city, it is easy to set the ground rules at the beginning, but it is a bit difficult if you're trying to create this kind of structure in already existing cities. How this can be achieved in already existing cities? He says that take from rich and redistribute to poor, basically. Redistribution, the distributive economics. It would require taking from the rich and redistributing to the poor. This resembles a kind of absolute equality of outcome. Aristotle here also references Plato again. Plato offers a more moderate solution. Plato's approach would be no citizen should possess more than 5 times the property of the poorest citizen. This is what Plato suggested. And today's terms, it sounds almost radical. It would be interesting what Plato would thought if he suddenly respond in 21st century, especially when we consider that the wealthiest people now control vastly more than that in today's economy. Interesting, what would Plato say about modern oligarchies? He would probably feel very sad. But here comes Aristotle's criticism of Phaleas, criticism of absolute equality of outcome. Equality alone is not enough. Aristotle agrees that property inequality can cause conflict, but he insists you can't fix inequality without also fixing desire. Even if you equalize material wealth, people's appetites, ambitions, and sense of injustice remain. And without education, or even what he hints could be called propaganda, people won't accept moderation or equality. In other words, you must train people to want less before you can give them equal shares. In a quote, further, factional conflict occurs not only because of inequality of property, but also because of inequality of honors, though in an opposite way in each case. For the many engage in factional conflict because possessions are unequal, but the refined do so if honors are equal. Nor do human beings commit injustice only on account of the necessary things, for which Phaleas considers equality of property a remedy, so that no one will steal through being cold or hungry. They also do it for enjoyment and satisfaction of desire. So conflict isn't really about wealth in practice. The masses revolt due to material inequality. The elite may revolt when honors are distributed equally, regardless of merit. So even a fully equal society in material wealth could still face rebellion, not from the poor, but from the proud. Not all crime is driven by need. Some people steal, dominate, or destroy simply for the pleasure of it. And human beings aren't purely rational. Many may act on irrational impulses. Socratic thinkers like Phaleas assume that crime arises from unmet needs, but Aristotle may respond by saying that that's naive. People don't become tyrants to stay warm. People sometimes have irrational desires. If you hope that you just distribute all the income equally among all the citizens, that would solve all the crime and everything. But in practice, what if people have different desires? What if people just want to commit a crime because they enjoy doing it? Or maybe they just get bored. Equal property might prevent some types of conflict, but it can't address ambition or pride. Some will believe that they deserve more due to their effort, skill, or status. And human desire is limitless. Even if you level everything, even if you equalize everything, someone will always want more. And Aristotle thinks that Socratic thinkers like Phaleas and Socrates himself doesn't consider these things when they try to understand what causes the crime and civil strife in societies. They assume that if you give everyone equal property, then everything else will be fine. Crime will disappear and everything will be fun and games. So for Aristotle, the legislator's task is not just economic redistribution, economic reform, but moral and psychological insight as well. The remedy cannot be total equality. It is moderation, education, and cultivation of virtue, especially the ability to desire the right things. He also flirts here with the idea of minimum wage, or maybe relevant to the universal basic income. He says at some point that uh, remedy can be considered as minimum property and work for everyone. So maybe in today's terms, it may be minimum wage or universal basic income to make sure that people do not commit crimes because they lack necessities in their lives. Healthcare, food, shelter. If you can provide these to the people by default, it may reduce some crime, but it's not a final solution. It's not a final remedy to get rid of crime and civil strife, factional conflict in cities. So we start from this point of view, okay, why crime exists? Why there's a factional conflict? Utopian thinkers, Socratic thinkers of his time would first point out because people have different levels of material wealth, property, and they ignore the rest of it, according to Aristotle. There's a good quote that says, for the refined may well become disaffected on the grounds that they do not merit mere equality. This idea of inequality of honors. From the city's point of view, from the legislator's point of view, it may sound rational that if you give everyone equal share, it will reduce all the crime. But the refined, those that work more, those that contribute more, may actually see this equality as unjust. And it may also alienate them. So legislators' task is to make sure that there is no civil strife, there is no crime in the city, to make sure that this doesn't come from the poor portion of the population, but also not from the richer portion of the population. You shouldn't alienate both parts of the city. That's all about the Aristotelian criticism about the idea of absolute equality of outcome. Yes, absolute equality of outcome may resolve some of the issues that gives rise to crime, but it cannot be final remedy if our aim here is to make sure that there is no civil strife, there is no factional conflict. It may also result in unintended consequences. If you level everything, make everything same, equal, how do you know that those people that regard equality as unjust will not rebel? Then Aristotle shifts focus on another philosopher of his time, Hippodamus, and his political theory, criticizing his political theory. Hippodamus says population should be divided into three classes: artisans, farmers, and warriors, and land divided into three parts: sacred land for the gods, public land for common use, and private land for citizens. And political system aims to balance different roles and economic functions in society. It includes popular sovereignty and legal reforms, including rewards for inventing new laws. Splitting citizens into rigid classes, according to Aristotle, weakens unity and mutual responsibility. Aristotle believes all citizens should share in ruling and being ruled, especially in military and deliberative duties. It is the definition of citizenship, according to Aristotle: being ruled and also having say in ruling, which we will cover also in the next episodes when we go to the chapters about understanding of citizenship from Aristotelian point of view. By excluding groups from political life, Hippodamus creates a two-tiered society: rulers and mere laborers. And there is a very radical idea that Hippodamus proposes: honoring those that propose new laws. So, for the sake of innovation, for the sake of adaptability. But then Aristotle objects here that too much legal change undermines the stability of the state. Laws gain authority over time, like customs or traditions, and frequent change may erode respect for the law and create confusion for people. And that concludes the part where Aristotle has been looking at the past philosophers, his teacher Plato, Socrates, never know how to pronounce his name in English properly, and the other philosophers of his time, that he basically considers them more utopian, not providing any practicalities regarding how these systems can be established. Then we move to the another part. Okay, we looked at all the past philosophers, their ideas, whether they can work in practice or not, what are the major challenges. Now, Aristotle goes into well-known political communities of his time. He's wearing the hat of historian, contemporary historian, and looking at the recent past. What went wrong with some cities, with some countries? He's acting like a modern historian of his time. He's focusing on three major examples from his time: Sparta, famous city-state, known for its militaristic lifestyle; Crete, island state in ancient Greece; and Carthage, modern-day Tunisia, uh, that was famous for its commerce, trade. Why does a powerful regime like Sparta decay from within? Aristotle investigates why Sparta, despite its military glory, fails as a stable and virtuous city. His answer isn't simple. It's layered critique of mismanaged institutions, unchecked inequality, and neglect of human nature. Starting from the common people, helots. The entire Spartan economy runs on the back of helots, a servile underclass forced to farm for the ruling citizens. Result is permanent fear of revolt. Harsh treatment breeds hatred and conspiracy. Aristotle says that Sparta employs rule by fear to make sure that helos stay in check. They do not revolt. In his understanding, Spartans never discovered stable or just way to rule over others, over helots that farm the land. And he also talks about the relationship between man and woman. There's a very nice, very interesting quote. It says, "For just as man and woman are a part of the household, it is clear that the city should be held to be very nearly divided in two, into a multitude of men and multitude of women. So in regimes where what is connected with woman is poorly handled, one must consider that legislation is lacking for half of the city." Why does he criticize this aspect in Spartan society? Aristotle says Spartan legislators trained the man for virtue, man for the war, for the aims of the war, for military, but left the woman unregulated. Doesn't mean that he's proposing to oppress the woman, but he's saying that, okay, you discipline men very harshly. They have to be raised from their childhood in army. They are taken from their families and raised in barracks as a warrior. You have this harsh treatment, harsh regulation of man's life, but then you ignore the woman completely. It says women lived in luxury and indulgence, disconnected from the city's warrior ideals. This created imbalance. Spartan society was morally split in two. In summary, is saying that you can't build civic strength if half the population is excluded from discipline and virtue. If you ignore half of the population, you are making a mistake, according to Aristotle. And Sparta of his time was very harsh society. Children, male citizens, would be trained for war from the age of 5, 6. Weak children were left to die, and they were always trained to be ready for the war. Even after they get married, they would live in barracks. They would train daily. There were harsh, strict regulations in their private lives. It was very totalitarian, even for its time. And there was also extreme wealth inequality in Sparta. Despite laws against selling land, Spartans could freely pass it on through inheritance, and over time a few families controlled most of the land. And this economic decay left the city militarily and politically vulnerable. Political system was also corrupt. There's a quote, "Yet when their education is such that even the legislator himself lacks trust in them as not being good men, it is not safe." The council of elders were supposed to check the power, but they became corrupt and tyrannical over time. And they were often chosen from the poor and uneducated. They were easily bribed. And even Spartan kings had to bribe them, had to appease them, creating this politically corrupt regime at the time. Senators held lifetime power without accountability. They were chosen through a childish public voting method, and candidates campaigned for the office, feeding ambition and greed. Lawmakers didn't trust kings, and it was very much atmosphere of power struggle masked by tradition. Common meals were meant to unite all Spartan citizens regardless of their wealth, symbolizing equality. But in practice, participation required a financial contribution, and the poor were excluded. And with that, they were also excluded from political life. And perhaps the most famous, the most crucial criticism of Aristotle is that Spartans didn't know how to be at leisure. They were always prepared for the war. But when there was no war, they didn't know how to manage their city. Quote, "Laws is with a view to a part of virtue, warlike virtue. For this is useful with a view to domination. Yet while they preserved themselves as long as they were at war, they came to ruin when they were ruling an empire through not knowing how to be at leisure. And because there is no training among them that has more authority than the training for war. They had one small part of virtue, warlike virtue, that may be useful in wars, but they didn't know how to be at leisure, how to govern their systems when there was no war around. Spartan citizens trained for one thing, victory in battle, obsessed with war, incapable of peace. No education in peace, philosophy or leisure, no vision for diplomacy, art or civic life. As long as Sparta was fighting, it thrived. But the moment the peace arrived, or empire needed managing, let's call it city-state, not really empire, it crumbled. And worst of all, they treated virtue as a means to power, not as the goal itself, domination. That was the main virtue existing in Sparta. Obsession with war. In summary, a society ruled by fear, helots, ruled by fear, common citizens, common people working on the lands, divided citizenry, ignoring women, one part of the city, a vanishing middle class, land inequality, corrupt political institutions, senators and kings and lawmakers, the tensions between these groups, and the people soul trained for the virtue of war, but blind to the peace. So externally, Sparta looked like an ideal state. Especially Plato admired Sparta. Very disciplined population, ready for war if needed by the state. People sharing meals regardless of the wealth. Very disciplined, always ready for the war. But that was all just an appearance. In its internal rulings, in its internal system, Sparta was deeply flawed. Men would fight, but then women would inherit all the luxury and they would get rich and then corrupt institutions while citizens were sharing meals. But in reality, over time, wealth inequality deepened between the citizens. For Aristotle, Sparta is a classic case of a regime that knows how to fight, how to win wars, but not how to live in peace. And that's why it did not last long. Next, Aristotle also criticized the regime in Crete. Crete shares Spartan flaws: oligarchy, inequality, and obsession with war. They had some strengths. They were better. They had better communal meal structure. Their economy was managing resources more efficiently, but the weaknesses were elite monopoly on power, arbitrary rule and lack of accountability, and fragile political order disguised as stability. And he even makes this case that Crete was lucky because it was a separate island separated from the wars that happened in the mainland Greece. And that was the reason that it existed. It survived for a long time. And it was because it was sustained by isolation, not by law or virtue. Finally, the last line of criticism, last line of political regime that existed in his time that he is considering is Carthage, the modern day Tunisia. They're a very well-known city-state that had colonies across the Mediterranean Sea. Those of you who are interested in history may also know that Carthage is probably well known for the wars with Roman Empire at the later stage, Punic Wars, where Romans gradually absorbed all the lands controlled by the Carthage and eventually destroyed the colonial empire of Carthage. So Carthage is a very commerce-oriented city-state that has colonies across the Mediterranean, in Spain, in Italy. Aristotle starts by acknowledging that Carthage is well-governed, even extraordinary in many respects. People accept the system in Carthage without the force that exists, for example, in Sparta. And there has been no history of tyranny or civil war. This is a rare feat in the politics of Mediterranean in ancient world. And there is a nice quote saying that it is a sign of a well-organized regime if the people voluntarily acquiesce in the arrangement of the regime, and if there has never been factional conflict worth mentioning or a tyrant. If people accept this regime voluntarily, think of it as a social contract that later thinkers like John Locke, Rousseau proposed and later on. So if people accept this regime voluntarily without the necessary need of force, as it exists, for example, in other cities like Sparta, then that's a good sign. And Carthage blended aristocracy and oligarchy more elegantly than Sparta or Crete. Kings are chosen for merit, not just for family lineage. But here's the catch. In Carthage, wealth is a requirement for high office. And it makes sense, because we discussed that Carthage is very commerce-oriented city-state / colonial empire. The idea in Carthage is that rulers need leisure to rule well, and the poor can't afford that. Aristotle says, okay, but when money becomes more honored than virtue, the whole city becomes greedy. They all seek money, even when they seek the politics, the office. It's like, how can I maximize my income so that I can enter politics, I can gain most amount of power, but there is little consideration of virtue, creating a good citizen, virtuous citizen. And buying office trains people to exploit their position, especially if they already spent a fortune to get it. And one of the interesting things that happens in Carthage is that same person may hold multiple offices. And this is seen as honorable in the case of Carthage, when one person has a lot of responsibilities. But Aristotle says that a city isn't a one-man show. Let each person focus on one job, do it well. Don't ask your shoemaker to play the flute, and let more people participate in public life. This would be more efficient. And here's a criticism. Another criticism is that Carthage avoids oligarchic collapse by sending citizens abroad to rule colonies where they gain wealth. And this eases inequality by accident, not by design. It is chance, not the law, that holds Carthage together, the nature of the empire, because it's always sustained by establishing colonies in different parts of the Mediterranean Sea. And when at home, where there's a factional conflict between different elites, rulers just send that elite to another city, colony, and says, okay, go and exploit that land and work that land, and that's how you can become rich. But Aristotle says that if ever rebellion breaks out at home at Carthage, there is no law, there is no sufficient law to restore stability. So in summary, Carthage is more successful than Sparta or Crete in balancing power and maintaining peace, but buying office undermines civic virtue. Concentrating offices in a few hands is inefficient. Wealth as a precondition for leadership can erode the moral foundations of the regime. And its stability isn't engineered. It is contingent on luck, and it's how it is built. And that concludes the Aristotle's criticism of political communities that are said to be the best at his time. He's basically saying, look at what happened when all the great minds tried to shape the real world. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they were misunderstood, and sometimes history had its own plans. In many ways, that's what makes Aristotle a very remarkable thinker and very empirical thinker that's even relevant to today's times. Unlike Plato, he doesn't start with grand theories. He starts by first criticizing, examining the other thinkers of his time, and then looking at the practice, looking at the real world, seeing what regimes exist in the real world, and examining how do they survive, how can they survive the best, what are the things that they're not doing well. And that concludes today's episode. Thanks a lot for watching. If you like this series, please consider liking, commenting, or subscribing, sharing with your friends. I will continue making these episodes about Aristotle's politics. If you enjoyed, stay in the loop because I will be sharing them at least once a week. Have a nice day. See you next time. Bye.